Picture this. It's 1942. A German submarine glides silently beneath the Atlantic, invisible to every ship above. The captain peers through his periscope, spots a merchant vessel, and signals his crew. Within seconds, a torpedo streaks through the water. The ship erupts in flames. The U-boat slips away into the darkness, undetected. For 2 years, the German U-boat fleet became the hunters of the ocean, nearly strangling Britain itself. But then everything changed. One technology would turn the tables so completely that the hunters became the hunted. This is the story of how sonar defeated the German U-boat threat and changed naval warfare forever. When Germany entered World War II, they had roughly 50 submarines. By 1942, that number had swelled to over 300. These weren't just any submarines. The Type 7EC U-boats were engineering marvels for their time, fast, maneuverable, and deadly. But what made them truly terrifying wasn't their design, it was their tactics. German U-boat commanders adopted a strategy called Rudeltaktik, the wolf pack tactic. Picture a group of wolves circling prey. A single U-boat would spot a British convoy. Rather than attack alone, it would surface and radio nearby submarines. Within hours, up to 20 U-boats would converge on the convoy, attacking from multiple angles in the darkness. The British Navy couldn't coordinate a defense against an enemy it couldn't see. The numbers were staggering. In 1942 alone, German U-boats sank 1,664 Allied ships, over 7 million tons of cargo. Ships carrying food, ammunition, oil, and troops to Britain were disappearing faster than they could be replaced. The British Navy was struggling. Churchill himself said, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." This wasn't just about military logistics. Britain was an island nation dependent on supplies from America. If the U-boats could cut off these supply lines, Germany could starve Britain into submission without ever firing a shot. For a moment, victory seemed within Germany's grasp. So why couldn't the Allies stop them? The answer is simple. You can't fight what you can't see. The Atlantic Ocean in the early 1940s was a hostile environment for naval combat. U-boats hunted at night, surfacing under cover of darkness. They moved silently underwater during the day. The ships they targeted had no way of knowing where danger lurked. Attempts to defend convoys were largely ineffective. Destroyers and escort vessels had only basic detection methods. They had hydrophones, primitive underwater listening devices, but they were unreliable and required the ship to move slowly to hear anything. By the time a threat was detected, it was usually too late. For the first 3 years of the war, the U-boat commanders called this period the happy time. They sank ships almost at will, with minimal losses to their own fleet. The Atlantic had become a graveyard. Here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Active sonar, the technology that would eventually defeat the U-boats, already existed. Both the British and the Americans had been developing it since before the war. But it was imperfect, unreliable, and controversial. The British called it ASDIC, Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee. The Americans called it Sonar, short for sound navigation and ranging. The principle was elegant. Send a sound wave down into the water. Listen for the echo bouncing off a submarine's hull, and measure the time it took to return. Calculate the distance, and you know exactly where the enemy is. But early sonar had problems. It was affected by water temperature changes, salinity, and thermal layers that bent sound waves unpredictably. In certain conditions, sonar would give false contacts, sending ships on wild goose chases. In other conditions, it would miss submarines entirely. Because of these limitations, the British Navy approached ASDIC conservatively. Naval leaders believed it worked only at close range, perhaps a few thousand yards. They thought U-boats deep underwater were nearly impossible to detect. This false confidence led to tragic mistakes. In 1942, British naval commanders insisted their ASDIC was so effective that convoys needed fewer escort ships. They reduced the number of destroyers assigned to protect merchant vessels. The logic seemed sound. Better technology meant better protection. But without understanding sonar's true limitations and without the training to use it effectively, British escorts became easier prey for wolf packs. Everything changed in 1943. Several factors aligned. First, the British finally understood how to use ASDIC properly. They realized that surface ships needed to stay close to convoys, work together with multiple escorts, and maintain constant vigilance. They trained their crews extensively. What had been a mysterious instrument became a powerful weapon in the hands of experienced operators. Second, new technologies began to arrive. Long-range aircraft equipped with improved radar and depth charges could patrol wider areas of the Atlantic. Once a U-boat was spotted, aircraft could attack before it disappeared. More importantly, the simple presence of air cover changed U-boat tactics. Commanders became reluctant to surface and attack during daylight hours. Third, and this is crucial, the Allies broke German radio codes. This meant they could sometimes predict where U-boat wolf packs were forming and route convoys away from danger. To understand why sonar was so revolutionary, we need to understand how it works. Active sonar operates on a simple principle: ping out a sound wave and listen for the echo. When a U-boat's hull reflects that sound back, operators hear a distinctive acoustic signature. But here's what makes it brilliant. Sound travels through water much faster than through air, about 1,500 meters per second. This means a ping can reach a target miles away in seconds and return just as quickly. In contrast, the fastest ship could only move a few hundred meters per second. Sonar operators could detect threats far faster than conventional lookouts could spot a periscope. As the war progressed, sonar technology improved dramatically. Range increased. Accuracy increased. Operators became more skilled at interpreting the sounds. Modern submarines discovered that once they were detected by sonar-equipped escorts, escape became nearly impossible. The escorts could coordinate their movements, predict the U-boat's heading, and launch precisely targeted attacks. For U-boat commanders, the turning point felt sudden, even though it was gradual. In early 1943, they were sinking dozens of ships per month. By mid-1943, losses were mounting. U-boats that had survived months of patrols suddenly faced coordinated attacks from ships and aircraft. Depth charges, explosives deployed by escort ships, became terrifyingly effective once their locations were known. The casualty rate for U-boat crews skyrocketed. In March 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached a critical moment. German U-boats attacked convoy ONS-5, which was protected by the newly equipped British escort group around HMS Walker. For 5 days, the battle raged. German U-boats sank 12 merchant ships, but they lost 6 submarines in the process. For the first time, the Allies inflicted more damage than they received. More importantly, the psychological impact was devastating for German commanders. The comfortable superiority they'd enjoyed was evaporating. German command didn't give up immediately. They tried new tactics. U-boats began traveling in tighter formations, hoping coordinated defense would protect them. Some attempted to avoid sonar by diving deeper and moving silently. But these tactics just made them slower and easier to locate. The Germans even tried to develop their own sonar, but they fell behind technologically and couldn't produce it in sufficient quantities. Desperation set in. By late 1943, U-boat commanders knew they faced something new and terrifying, but they couldn't fully understand what it was or how to defeat it. The final chapter came with the introduction of advanced radar on escort vessels and aircraft. Radar could detect a U-boat's periscope, breaking the surface even in darkness. Combined with sonar, this meant U-boats had nowhere to hide. They couldn't stay submerged indefinitely. Diesel-electric submarines of that era needed to surface regularly to recharge their batteries. They couldn't remain on the surface. Aircraft and radar-equipped ships would spot them instantly. By 1944, German U-boat losses had become unsustainable. The happy time was over. The defeat of the U-boat threat was one of the most significant naval victories of World War II, yet it's often overshadowed by stories of surface battles and amphibious invasions. But its impact was enormous. Without defeating the U-boats, the Allies couldn't have maintained supply lines to Britain, couldn't have prepared for D-Day, and couldn't have sustained the American military presence in Europe. More importantly, sonar fundamentally changed how navies think about submarine warfare. The era of the hunter became the era of the hunted. Submarines were no longer invisible predators. They were vulnerable targets once located. This technological shift had consequences that echo to this day. Modern submarines adopted features designed to evade sonar, special coatings that absorb sound waves, hull shapes that reflect sonar less effectively, quieter engines, and advanced combat systems. But the basic principle remains unchanged. In a confrontation between a submarine and a sonar-equipped escort, the submarine is at a disadvantage unless it can remain undetected. The balance of power in submarine warfare has remained precarious and highly dependent on technology ever since. During the Cold War, American and Soviet submarines played an elaborate game of detection and concealment. The side with better sonar had an advantage. Today, the world's best submarines are those that can avoid detection by the most advanced sonar systems. One final thought. Sonar didn't defeat the U-boats because it was a magic weapon. It succeeded because it solved a fundamental problem. For 3 years, the Allies were fighting blind. Sonar gave them their sight. Once they could see the U-boats, they could fight them effectively. Technology alone doesn't win wars, but the right technology, properly deployed, can turn an impossible situation into a winnable one. The sonar revolution proved that. The German U-boat program had almost strangled Britain and nearly changed the course of World War II. But one innovation, sonar, proved more powerful than all those submarines combined. The hunters of the Atlantic became the hunted. And in this story of technology triumphing over strategy, we see a fundamental truth about modern warfare. The side that controls information and can see their enemy has an overwhelming advantage. In 1943, the Allies finally had that advantage, and everything changed.